The process of selling this product internationally has become complex to the point that the company has decided to exit the business.
So that every year, despite the fact that Saudi Arabia comes in at the bottom of the list, we don't impose any sanctions on Saudi Arabia.
Hello, my name is Stanley Heller. Welcome to The Struggle. The Struggle is shown from Vermont to New York City and in Washington, D.C. Our YouTube channel is Struggle Video Media. The campaign to stop U.S. support for the Saudi war against Yemen is picking up steam. In a small but definite victory, the Rhode Island firm Textron has decided to bow to pressure and stop making cluster bombs. Rhode-IslandFuture.org reports that Textron spokesperson David Sylvester said, "The process of selling this product internationally has become complex to the point that the company has decided to exit the business. Under a different political environment, it would have been a sustainable business for us." Cluster bombs are banned in 119 nations, but not in the U.S. or Saudi Arabia. Textron was the last North American company to produce and sell cluster bombs, and one of the last private companies in the world to do so. The unprovoked Saudi attack on Yemen continues. It has full U.S. government support. Billions in weapons, air refueling of Saudi planes, help in targeting, and support at the UN. The capital, Sana'a, at the end of August. 6 major libraries destroyed. In one recent week, 1,600 Saudi U.S. airstrikes. 2,500 children killed directly. But there's a far worse toll. According to UNICEF, in March, 10,000 more succumbed to disease in the past year because of lack of access to clean water or health care. 10,000 children and counting. As we've reported, the president has approved a $1.1 billion Saudi arms deal. This would replace weapons that the Saudis used in killing the Yemenis. Congress can cancel this deal. At the end of August, 63 members of the House sent a letter asking for time to debate the matter. There are conflicting reports, but it appears now that Congress does have until the end of September to cancel the deal. You can do something about this. You can phone call your member of the House or your senator. Tell them what you think about U.S. support for the beastly Saudi monarchy. Demand they cancel this arms deal. If you go to thestruggle.org, one of the top links will get you the phone numbers of your senator or member of the House. One of the great campaigners against Saudi tyranny and war is Medea Benjamin. Here she is some months ago in Washington, D.C., entering a businessman luncheon for the Saudis, making her point and getting tossed out.
Don't do business with the bloody Saudi monarchy. Stop the bloody regime in Saudi Arabia. Stop the killing in Yemen. Stop the killing in Yemen. The Saudi regime is killing women and children in Yemen. Stop the bloody Saudi monarchy. The Saudi regime has blood on its hands. The Saudi regime has blood on its hands. Stop the killing! Stop the killing in Yemen! Stop the Saudis from killing in Yemen! Stop the killing! Stop the Saudi killing in Yemen! Saudi monarchy. It represses its own people. It represses women. It spreads extremist ideology. Stop the Saudi regime. Stop the bloody Saudi regime. Don't do business with Saudi Arabian monarchs.
Medea Benjamin has written a new book about the Saudis, Kingdom of the Unjust, her 8th book. She was in Connecticut last week speaking to a combined audience of 100 people. This from her talk in Hartford.
The more I learned and the more I researched about the book, the more I couldn't believe it. It's like, how did we, progressive people in this country, allow this relationship to go on and on and on and on when it makes absolutely no sense? It makes absolutely no sense for the people inside Saudi Arabia, no sense for people around the world who want to live and practice Islam in peace, and makes no sense for the security of us in the United States. And talking about Islam, I don't want what I say to be feeding into the Islamophobia that people like Donald Trump have been so dangerously pushing. Because we in this room probably understand that the vast majority of people who practice Islam practice a very peaceful, loving kind of Islam, and are horrified by what the right-wing intolerant clerics in Saudi Arabia stand for, what they have pushed down the throats of the Saudi people, and what they have been spreading around the world. And so in my research, I went back to the beginnings of how did this all start. And this cleric, Muhammad Wahab, back in the 1700s, spouting this extremely intolerant version of Islam that my version is the only version and it's the pure version of the Quran, and anybody else who has a different one and believes in practices that honor the shrines and other holy sites that are not the ones that I say are the holy sites is an infidel. And this guy would have gone down in history as some kind of kooky guy had it not been that he hooked up with a very ambitious family, the Saud family, who said, aha, we'll latch on to you and you'll latch on to us, and together we can go marauding and conquering throughout the Arabian Peninsula, and we'll have your religion as the justification for doing this, and I'll have my fighters who will be the ones who will protect us. And so this very unholy alliance was formed, and indeed they went to conquer the holiest sites in the Arabian Peninsula of Mecca and Medina. Well, so they, went on for a while, and then came another unholy alliance, and that came with the discovery of oil, the discovery of oil. And boy, talk about a toxic relationship with a toxic substance. And oil gave the Saudis this immense power in the world. And the U.S. then latched on to the Saudis and said, aha, you've got a lot of oil, let's make another deal here. And this was particularly with Franklin Delano Roosevelt, World War II. You sell us the oil and we will provide you with protection. Well, that has gone on and on and on and on. Democratic administrations, Republican administrations has kept going with this very, very toxic alliance. And when I say toxic alliance, let's look for a minute at what this has meant for the Saudi people internally. Now, we know the U.S. government has gone around the world invading other countries saying, we're going to liberate you and we're going to bring democracy to you, like they said around Iraq. Well, they've never said that around Saudi Arabia. But look at the internal workings of this Saudi regime, first of all, still named after a family, still run by a king and a couple of hundred princes who treat the country as their fiefdom and the oil as their personal resource. It's a country that has none of the trappings of democracy. It doesn't even bother to pretend. There's no election for a president. There's no election for a Congress or an assembly or anything like that. After pressure internally and externally, including the U.S. saying, come on, give us something that we could say there's some reform going on in Saudi Arabia, they said, okay, we'll have municipal elections. That started in 2005. And these municipal elections are for councils that have absolutely no legislative power. They can't. They can recommend where you might put the parks or how the garbage might be collected, but they have no power at all. But this was seen as a great step forward, except there was a problem there. They wouldn't give women the right to vote. So the U.S. and others, including women inside Saudi Arabia, said, come on, it's the year 2000 and something. They said, all right, the next time we have elections, we'll let women vote in the municipal elections. Well, 2011 came and went, and women were still not allowed the right to vote. 2015, last year, they had the elections, and finally they gave women the right to vote in these municipal councils and the right to run in the councils, except there were additional problems, like the fact that women had a real disadvantage in running because they couldn't address a group like this, because this group is a mixed gender group, and they're not allowed to talk directly to men. And so the women, the vast majority of the voters were men. So of the thousands of people voted onto these different municipal councils, only 1 of them were women. And then when those women in their different councils went to the meetings, they were told, oh, you can't sit in the meeting with us. You've got to go sit somewhere else, because Saudi Arabia is the most gender segregated country in the world. Not only are women forced in public to wear a full covering abaya, but there are separate entrances for women in government buildings, separate entrances in McDonald's, for God's sakes, or Starbucks. Not only separate entrances, but you have to sit in a separate section for women. So Saudi Arabia, a country that doesn't allow for political parties, doesn't allow for free speech, doesn't allow for free assembly. What happens if you dare to speak up against the government is you would usually wind up in prison, or you might wind up dead, because Saudi Arabia is a country that has one of the highest rates of the death penalty, and the main form of killing people is by beheadings. That's right. And we see the gruesome beheadings that groups like ISIS have done. Where do they get it from? They get it from Saudi Arabia. And when I was researching this book, there was a young man, a young dissident from the Shia minority, who had done nothing violent, but had participated in protests. Remember when the Arab Spring started in 2011? Well, there were people inside Saudi Arabia who said, well, wait, maybe this is our time as well, especially in the eastern province where the Shia minority live, and they happen to live in the oil-rich part of the country, but they don't get the benefits like the rest of the country does. And so they rose up in 2011 and were crushed. And one of the people who was sentenced to death was a 17-year-old boy, and I looked into his case online. We got in touch with his family, and it turned out that he was not only sentenced to death, he was sentenced to crucifixion. And I had no idea what that meant. What does that mean? And it turned out that they have their own Saudi form of crucifixion, which is you first cut off the person's head, and then you tie the person up on a pole with the head hanging off the side, and leave them up there for several days, like 3 days, in a public place, as a warning for the rest of the population. These are our friends. These are our great allies, the Saudi regime. It really is remarkable. So when you look at how people inside Saudi Arabia are treated. I mentioned the Shia minority, but that brings up the issue of freedom of religion. And you know, in our country, our elected officials tend to be very religious people, right? Why are you laughing? Even Donald Trump says he's very religious. He's read the Bible more than anyone else, but don't ask him to quote from it because there are so many good passages he wouldn't know which one to choose from. So in 1998, the Congress passed something called the International Freedom of Religion Act. And this is an act that, along with it, it said our Congress is going to study every single year which countries around the world are the worst in terms of letting people practice their religion freely. And if there are countries that are really bad, we're going to do something about it. We're going to sanction these countries. Well, every year the congressional report looks at Saudi Arabia. And they say, oh my goodness, well, it is a country that is a theocracy, so you might think they'd respect religion, but they only respect religion if it's the Wahhabi Islam version, not the Shia version, not maybe the way the Sufis might want to practice. And God forbid you should want to practice something publicly other than Islam. Well, there are millions of people living in Saudi Arabia who are not Muslims. And anybody know why that is? Why? Migrant workers, that's right. Millions of migrant workers that build the Saudi Arabia, that do the heavy construction work out in the desert, that work in people's homes, domestic workers, drivers for the women. They're foreign workers. And there's about 10 million of them coming from poor countries all over the world, like India and Pakistan and Bangladesh and Indonesia and parts of Africa. And it turns out they're about a third of the population. And 2 million of them are Christians. But Saudi Arabia is the only country in the world where it would be illegal to build a church, where it would be illegal to distribute Bibles. And until 2004, Saudi Arabia said it was illegal to come into the country if you were Jewish. So imagine the congressional report every year doesn't say very good things about Saudi Arabia. In fact, they rate them at the very bottom, along with North Korea and with Burma, as being among the worst of the worst. Well, you know the kind of sanctions we put on North Korea, right? You know the kind of sanctions we put on Burma. Well, why don't we have sanctions on Saudi Arabia? Well, that was a legitimate question, and I went to research it. And I called up the people in the congressional office that do these reports, and I asked them. And they said, oh, well, that is because the State Department, which you know is the highest diplomatic arm of our government, ever since 2004, passed a waiver on Saudi Arabia. And it's not just a waiver for 1 year, it's called an indefinite waiver. So that every year, despite the fact that Saudi Arabia comes in at the bottom of the list, we don't impose any sanctions on Saudi Arabia. Quite amazing, isn't it? But that is an opening that we have. And when we talk more about what can we do about this, you might want to remind me of this opening, because the law says we're supposed to sanction countries that don't respect the right to religion. We have all these religious people supposedly in Congress. Maybe we could try to get that waiver lifted. So here we have a country where people are put in prison for blogging things that question the role of the government, that say maybe we'd want to do something like separating religion and government. Some people might have heard of a very well-known case of a blogger named Raif Badawi, and well-known because his case was taken up by Amnesty International. But it's indicative of so many cases. This young man had a blog and questioned the government and said that we ought to respect other people's beliefs and maybe we should be a more liberal country. Well, for that he was accused of spreading atheism and sentenced to death. The sentence was then changed to 10 years in prison and 1,000 lashes. Medieval kind of stuff. And his wife, very smart, got out of the country with her 3 children, got asylum in Canada, and started this campaign around him. And when they took him out for the first set of lashes, it was on a Friday after Friday prayer. What a perfect time to flog someone in a public square. And they gave him 50 lashes, and somebody recorded it and put it on the internet. And that created a lot of problems for the Saudi government, because people said, how could you do this? This is barbaric for somebody who was just posting things on a blog. And so since then, and this is over a year ago, he has never been taken out for more of the flogging, which shows that the Saudis can be susceptible to international pressure. Unfortunately, the young man still remains in prison and still has a 10-year sentence. His lawyer, a human rights lawyer, his name is Walid Abu Khair, was convicted for, among other things, trying to give counsel to this blogger, and was sentenced to 15 years in prison. Again, you shake your head. How could these be our friends? So this is some of the internal kinds of issues. We brought up the question of migrant workers. You might have heard, because Saudi and the other Gulf states are very infamous for the way they treat migrant workers. Imagine these poor workers who come on the idea that they're going to get well paid, that they're going to have good jobs, that they're going to be able to make enough money to send money back to their families, and they're desperate to help their families. So they travel to Saudi Arabia already indebted because they have to pay a recruitment fee and they have to pay for their airfare. It is illegal, but employers often then take the passport of the migrant worker. And the system is a sponsorship system, so that you can only get in the country if you already have an employer. And that employer then is basically your master. You cannot leave the employer no matter how bad they might be. The employer has the right to transfer your employment to somebody else if they want to, even if you don't want that to happen. And the kinds of stories that I uncovered when I did this research are really hair-raising. It makes you understand that there are some Saudis, and certainly this is not true of all Saudis. There are many Saudis who are good employers, but there are some Saudis, and it's the system itself that allows this, to treat their workers like slaves, to work them 12 hours a day, to work them 7 days a week. And I relate in the book stories where in the hospital they had to pull out nails that the employer had nailed into the forehead and the arms of an employee who complained too much. Or how an Indian domestic worker realized that she had been taken and this was a horrible job and she was locked in her room, and to try to escape she made a rope out of her saris and tried to get out the window, and the employer, a woman, came in and hacked off her arm. Horrible, horrible things. And back in the home countries, there are countries who have said we will not allow any of our citizens to go to Saudi Arabia anymore. So this is domestically some of the conditions. Then let's look a little bit on what Saudi does in the world. So I talked about Wahhabism being this very intolerant form of Islam. Well, the Saudis with the oil money have used billions of dollars of oil money to spread Wahhabism around the world. My partner Ty Barry and I have been to Pakistan, and we've seen the way the Saudi madrasas or schools have taught people to hate the West, taught people to hate Shia, have spread this view of Islam that makes young people pick up a gun and join the jihad. We've seen how the Saudis have funded mosques all over the world, sometimes without a problem, and many times with problems, because they often bring the imams in to Saudi Arabia and train them, and then send them back and pay their salaries. And in country after country, even President Obama talked about Indonesia that practices a very tolerant version of Islam. When the Saudis have come in, you can track how the mosques that are run by the Saudis are changing the way people are practicing Islam. So we have the spread through the madrasas. We also have a very insidious relationship of Saudi young people picking up a gun and going, whether it was to Afghanistan with the United States to overthrow the Soviets, or whether it's now going to join Al-Qaeda or going to join ISIS. Thousands of Saudi young men have gone to Syria and Iraq to join ISIS.
As we record some bitter news, Assad forces, supported by unlimited Russian bombing, has again put the liberated area of Aleppo under siege. And the striking Taj Mahal workers have been notified that their billionaire owner, Carl Icahn, has decided to close down the hotel in October rather than pay the men and women pension and health benefits. That's our program for today. See you next week at this time. I'm Stanley Heller, and this is The Struggle.